Welcome back and to this next episode of Mapping the Shadow. Continuing in today's episode on this discussion of evil, and it's a very, very key part of this whole journey, right, of shadow work. I've made the case that I think it ends in an understanding of evil and the difference between evil and good, and also part of this model, the shadow map model that I'm sharing. Understanding where evil fits within this is really key, because it's really about coming to see things ever more clearly, let's not forget. And that means that when we experience the world, when we experience other people, when we experience our own mind, our own thoughts and feelings, we have to be able to discern between mere subjective likes and dislikes versus what is objectively unwholesome and evil and self-contradictory. So there's a clue there. Like, what do we mean when we say evil? Well, we mean something that is incessantly self-contradictory. It's one thing to say, oh, I don't like this or that. I don't particularly like it when someone turns up and they're acting all kind, but really they're just trying to get something from me. Or when someone is very, very selfish, but actually they're just practicing legitimate self-care and I can't figure out the difference. There's a lot more to it than that. It's not just about subjective preferences. We ourselves, no doubt, have preferences. You have preferences. I have preferences. Maybe you identify as though you have a certain personality type under the Myers-Briggs system or something like that. Maybe you have certain cards in your tarot birth chart, like, I don't know, the 6 of discs. Maybe this is your purpose card, for example. Maybe you happen to feel that that shows up pretty well in your life. Maybe you don't particularly like it when people judge you as taking it too far. It's one thing to help others. It's one thing to build teams and pay your dues. It's another thing to get involved in meddling, manipulation, discrimination. And on the other hand, what about autonomy? What about honoring others' freedom? What about dynamism? What about when that becomes exaggerated to the point of being uncollaborative, unproductive, or even evading, right? Not paying your taxes, this kind of thing. So is there some kind of difference between these extremes? Is this just merely subjective? Is this just merely human-made axioms that we can more or less hopefully agree on? Maybe haven't figured it out yet, but we'll get there eventually. Or is there something more objective to this? And if so, how on earth can we define that, let alone understand it? Well, good news is that there is. The bad news is that it is a lifetime's work to really understand. I think you can understand it to a pretty useful, meaningful degree, but the process of self-knowledge never ends. And so there is such a thing as evil, and it helps no one to pretend that it doesn't exist. And that I would go so far as to say that actually understanding the nature of evil from a psychological, philosophical, and spiritual perspective is of utmost importance, because it is the challenger. Sometimes people equate shadow with evil, but pick out a random page from Jung's collected works with the word shadow on it, and you'll probably find something that contradicts that belief somewhat. A very, very rudimentary understanding of the shadow might judge it as evil or regard it as evil, but then maybe it comes full circle in the end, because after all, the shadow is the archetypal challenger, and in that way it serves a purpose. We need something to bring out our best. And so the shadow is that which opposes us. In this model, as I'm showing on screen for those watching on video, I've placed the shadow as the antithesis to the persona. So it's precisely what the persona leaves out. And it's also what the persona needs in order to become what it truly can be. Not a mask, not a persona per se, but maybe something deeper, maybe something more integrated, something more wholesome. Maybe if you identify as, say, an INFJ in the Myers-Briggs system, the full realization of the INFJ includes something like ESTP, or at least as I've indicated here. But more specifically, what that means is that the full expression of someone who uses introverted intuition in a very effective way. So that's like this seer energy, this seer archetype, perhaps, uses extroverted feeling, or maybe you might think of that as like a caregiver archetype, broadly speaking. But for that to come into full realization, they need a bit of the opposite too. They need a bit of the sage. They need a bit of the experiencer or artisan. Because if they're denying that, the great irony is that they actually sell their intuition and their feeling sure. This is fundamental to the shadow map. This is about duality and enantiodromia. That actually the extremes become their opposites in the end. So they have to be reconciled with each other. So then, ultimately coming to understand the objective difference between wholesome and unwholesome is a key part of this work, and is also intellectually, it's one of the tools you have to bear in mind. So then, to really understand the nature of evil and how it self-contradicts, we've got a bunch of quotes from Schelling to look at, and also Jung. So in the Freedom Essay, Schelling said, "Thus is the beginning of sin, that man transgresses from authentic being into non-being, from truth into lies, from the light into darkness, in order to become a self-creating ground, and with the power of the centrum which he has in himself, to rule over all things. But the feeling still remains in the one having strayed from the centrum, that he was all things, namely in and with God. For that reason he strives once again to return there, but for himself, and not where he might be all things, namely in God." So, very powerful, eloquent words from Schelling here. And I do recommend you check out the Freedom Essay if you're feeling like you want something really tough to get stuck into, but which will leave you with a lot to think about. Very profound writing, and probably the best writing we have on the nature of evil and freedom. And notice it's called the Freedom Essay, but it's largely about evil as well. Why? Well, because these two things are intimately related. So what he's talking about here is, well, to sin, to miss the mark. What does that mean? Well, it means to be partial, right? And there's a degree of necessity in that. But what does it mean when it becomes evil? Well, that is when, through using the power of freedom and with the memory of wholeness, which we all have, being a microcosm or the macrocosm, being partial, we have this kind of template of wholeness within us. But we need to engage with the world in order to fully realize it, to make the implicit explicit. And so what evil does is it tries to bend everything to itself. So as he says here, having strayed from the centrum, and for that reason strives to return there, but for himself, and not where he might be all things, namely in God. I'm going to show you this on a shadow map, what this actually looks like, visually, how this comes about. But first, let's go to another quote from Schelling. So he says, "In evil, there is the self-consuming and always annihilating contradiction that it strives to become creaturely just by annihilating the bond of creaturely existence, and out of overweening pride to be all things, falls into non-being. So then, at the heart of all evil is a contradiction, a self-consuming self-contradiction, always annihilating contradiction, in his words, that it strives to become something purely by annihilating the very bond it needs for it to exist at all. In other words, it wants to live in a universe that couldn't exist. It denies the rational order of the universe. And as I've tried to explain, and will elaborate on again, this rational order is not merely happenstance. It's not something that was externally imposed by God, or something outside of existence. It is actually the only way things possibly can be, because everything must comply with everything else on some level. When you go about your day, things don't just suddenly defy the laws of physics, right? There has to be certain consistencies. Pigs don't suddenly just start flying around. If you remembered putting on a white shirt this morning, like I seem to have done, then it's not suddenly going to change colour halfway through the day. There's an imprint in the mind, there's a memory. And bearing in mind that the idealists all stood by this paradigm of the universe is mind created, or at least that the mind plays a primary role. It's not that we just all appeared here in material somehow for some reason we can't figure out, but that actually it's kind of, they rise together. And mind is what there is, including material itself. It's in mind. And so for that to make sense to itself, it must comply. It must be rational. A simple way of thinking about this is that everything checks out in the end. There's nothing that's unrelated. There's nothing that's separate from existence. There's nothing that doesn't make sense ultimately, or play some kind of role in that regard. Like, there's nothing that just arbitrarily exists separately from everything else. No. And this is another reason why you can, as they say, see the universe in a grain of sand, or in, this notebook here. Like, on one level, it contains the whole universe, because not only because if you looked at it very, very closely, you'd see atoms, subatomic particles, you'd see certain rules, certain themes that play out. They may be partial, but they may also be representative of stars, everything else, the galaxies. But also because, what is this notebook? What is this object? Well, one way of thinking about it is that it's everything else around it. It is precisely the product of this right here. Everything is the universe around the notebook, right? So, in principle, it implies everything else. The entire universe, from here to Betelgeuse to the Andromeda Galaxy to everything else beyond that, is implied in this object. Because if it didn't exist, they wouldn't exist, and vice versa. So, this gets pretty far out. But the idea is not to try and figure all that out in your head and make a calculation of it all, so much as it's to understand the relationship. It's to understand that there's nothing beyond that rational order. So its ultimate essence might be this ultimate non-contradiction or perfection. There's nothing that contradicts at essence in a way that doesn't make sense or isn't rational, even though that there is certainly contradiction everywhere, like in a temporal existence. And so the universe is both the only way it possibly could be, on one hand, while simultaneously allowing for endless creativity and freedom. And that is pretty tricky to get your head around. But if you can penetrate that, you're making some good efforts into understanding the nature of yourself and your mind, and why you experience what you experience, and why you do what you do. So back to evil then. Evil essentially is that which, through its own freedom, denies that very fact. And so it actually contradicts itself, and it destroys and thwarts itself, because it denies itself and the very thing it needs to be what it wants to be. It wants to live in a universe that could not just merely doesn't exist, but could not exist. And so morality is not something that's externally prescribed. We may set laws in our world, we have a duty to do that. Hegel was all about this, right? He talked about how the institutions of the world are not so much there to try and uphold spirit, but more like reflections of it, more like manifestations of the natural order. But here's the key: in that particular place and time. So the idea is not that we ought to try to fix things, but that we reflect the current understanding and moment in time and embody the natural order in society. That's why we have laws. That's why we have jails. That's why we have court systems. They're certainly not perfect, and that's a bit of an understatement. And every now and then, they become so imperfect that they just cannot help but be reworked into something else, every couple of centuries or whatever. So the evil is that which tries to become something by annihilating the very thing it needs to exist. That's its fundamental contradiction. But it shows up in every other way as well, like all these various particular ways. And out of what he calls overweening pride to be all things, it wants to be all things and therefore falls into non-being, causes itself to fall into non-being. That's an antiodromia, that's the denial of energy and rationality, and hence it must come up against that which it excludes and must dissolve into it eventually. So next quote then, Schelling said, "The fear of life itself drives man out of the centrum into which he was created. For this centrum, as the purest essence of all willing, is for each particular will a consuming fire. In order to be able to live within it, the man of all particularity must become extinct, which is why the attempt to step out of this centre into the periphery is almost necessary in order to seek there some calm for his selfhood. Hence, the general necessity of sin and death as the actual extinction of particularity through which all human will as a fire must cross in order to be purified. Well, if you wanted an image to describe that, I would like to think that the shadow map comes fairly close. This is exactly what I'm trying to capture with this map. It's taking the thoughts of people like Schelling, but also Jung and Fichte and Hegel and Kant and others, and trying to capture it in a model, an image. So there is this need to move out, following the arcs of adaptation and transformation. Haven't talked about those much yet, but hopefully that's fairly self-explanatory. There has to be this adaptation because there's the fear of life itself driving man out of the centrum into which he was created. So there needs to be this particularity. There needs to be both wholeness and particularity and the movement between the two. That's what the map is showing. And hence the general necessity of sin, of missing the mark, of falling short or being, I think that's like being misaligned from what there is. Falling short in some way. It's necessary. And in that sense, it's also kind of perfect. Like it's included within it. And this is a key lesson as well around the understanding of evil. Because evil exists as part of this whole same system. This is the whole point. Let's jump to this idea of the dissonance loop. Evil is the dissonance loop. Simple. It's the idea existing for itself and only itself, and that's that. And that's just what Schelling was explaining with those previous quotes there. But the answer to that is to understand it. It's not to endorse it, but it's to understand the reasons for its existence, and that actually it exists because of something good. It exists because of freedom, because of perfection, and that precisely means that there must be the possibility for evil. I wouldn't go so far as to say that means that evil is a good thing, because that would just be complete contradiction. But no, we have to be able to recognize within that same framework that no, evil is a bad thing. It's evil. Like, we have to be able to acknowledge that. We can't just bypass and say, oh no, it's a great thing, really. It makes us all stronger. There's some truth in that. But I think really coming to terms with that is a case of understanding that not only is the universe the only way it could be, but it's also containing endless freedom and potential for self-determination at the same time as being the only way it could be. And at the same time, it's actually perhaps the best it could be, in a sense, insofar as it is freedom and contains freedom. And that means that it's all the better, not so much because of evil, but for the fact that it contains evil, for the fact that it contains something that allows evil to exist and permits evil to exist, but allows something even better to persist as well. In other words, that freedom might be such a high value that it's higher even than protection from evil itself, or the absence of evil itself. It's better to have a world that is free than one that is rid of evil. Ultimately, it's freedom that allows not only evil to exist, but for evil to be overcome. And I'd say it's not only better, and the reason it's a higher value is because it's the only way anything can happen. Because otherwise, the mind would have to violate itself, and that couldn't happen. So then, the dissonance loop. What is this? So this is a key piece of this whole theory and model, and it's called a dissonance loop because, well, firstly, it's dissonant. It is marked by flagrant contradiction at all levels. It is completely at war with itself. It tries to look kind, but actually becomes evil through its obsession with kindness. It tries to be efficient, but actually becomes completely rigid in its so-called efficiency, or ruthless. It tries to be very logical, but becomes so logical that it actually starts using logic to bolster and justify itself and itself alone. It uses it in service of itself and then conveniently ignores it when it would violate its own existence. So it's marked by this dissonance at all levels. You can feel it, you can hear it when you encounter it. You have this almost like a felt sensation of this jarring incongruence when you encounter the dissonance loop. And likewise, it is a loop. It's a loop because it must still circumambulate. It must still be in motion. But it's a different kind of motion, because it's not the kind of motion that ambulates the self and is seeking to reconcile with itself through empathy. The thing that defines it is not just dissonance, but also the lack of empathy. It's kind of the same thing. It insists on remaining split in its desperate attempts to appear as it wants to appear, because that's how it feels whole in itself. And it decides that rather than connect with what there is, that the best solution is to just paste over the dissonance with expedient illusions. So, for example, when called into question, when faced with the reflection of its own unkindness, it tries to prove its kindness by being as cruel as possible. How dare you accuse me of being unkind? It tries to prove its honesty through dishonesty. It lies to people. It creates a narrative behind the scenes. It tries to create a PR campaign in a desperate attempt to uphold its honest imagery. And say if it's violence and it becomes accused of being violent, it may try to physically attack and shut down and capture or silence those who accuse it of violence. Just complete flagrant contradiction at all levels, and in complete obliviousness to its own irony. Like everyone else around can see, maybe not even necessarily everyone, because there's a lot of projection going on and it usually has a following, but anyone who's paying attention and practicing empathy can see that it is doing precisely the thing it claims not to be doing. This is irony. This is a large part of why we have projection, as I discussed a few episodes ago. This is the dissonance loop. So even though it's not circumambulating the self in quite the same way, it's circumambulating its own self, its own idea of self. So it's still engaged in a kind of reaching out and a kind of coming back. There's a kind of sort of eros and thanatos going on there. God knows that when it goes out to you and gets you to try and bolster its image of itself, the moment you stop doing that, you will see the other side. And you'll feel that wrath and destruction. It will try to destroy you in order to protect its own image. So there's still a kind of circumambulation going on here. That's why it's a loop. But it's looping the self-desired ground, the thing that Schelling's referring to. It's trying to come back to make all things for itself, bend the absolute to itself. So it tries to become its own centrum, which we all must do to an extent, but it does that to such a degree that it turns its back on the self from which it came, right? Let's move on now to a quote from Jung in Collected Works 12. And he said that an inflated consciousness, which is basically one that's engaging in dissonance, an inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. So egocentric is literally centered around the ego. This is the dissonance loop. Egocentric, not self-centric, not circumambulating the archetype of the self or the notion of the self, but circumambulating the idea of self. So Jung says, it is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of understanding contemporary events, and incapable of drawing right conclusions about the future. This consciousness is hypnotized by itself, and therefore it cannot be argued with. It inevitably dooms itself to calamities that must strike it dead. So I didn't have that on screen, but here it is now. So that very nicely sums it up. It's inflated. It's trying to take everything to itself, the energy of the archetype of which it's trying to experience. Often this is the self archetype, but it can be all kinds of archetypes. It can be any archetype. Ultimately, they all serve as fractals of the self. So it's trying to gain a kind of wholeness, a kind of selfhood through its image. But it doesn't want to realize the essence. It just wants to be with the image that it has now. Because everything else is pain, everything else is work, everything else is tension. And in the absence of empathy, it has no desire, will, or ability to actually navigate that tension. And so for that reason, this harks back to what I was talking about with the mechanisms of projection and those workings of the mind there. Therefore, it is incapable of learning from the past, or understanding contemporary events, or drawing right conclusions about the future, because it is interminably self-referential, is viewing all of that in terms of its pre-existing established self-image. It cannot adjust its self-image in line with experience and reality. It must therefore necessarily update its apparent rendering of reality in terms of the self-image. Everything must subsume to that pre-existing notion that's just been decided. Notion's not even the right word. It's more like the idea as opposed to the underlying notion. It's trying to access that notion of selfhood, but it's doing that through a partial image that it becomes completely enamored with, hypnotized by itself. For the same reason, it cannot be argued with, it cannot shift, it cannot change, and yet it exists in a reality where change must occur. So for that reason, it must strike itself dead in the end, because it's trying to bend the absolute to its particulars. And so the higher form of the self, the world itself, in its need to maintain rational order, will eventually call it into question. Sooner or later, it must deteriorate by virtue of the very things it's left out. So it becomes like so one-sided, beyond the point of just taking its idea to its full development and over into the territory of just trying to become the new centrum and bending everything to itself and having no interest whatsoever in any kind of transformation of that image. It will work with objects in the world, but it will always be rendering them in terms of this tantalizing self-image that it has. Okay. So that brings us on to some questions about evil and projection and making an assessment of truth, whether that be understanding ourselves or what we experience in the world. Not only is evil important to understand, but it's important to understand how it comes about and why it comes about. On one level, you can understand this simply from the shadow map, right? It comes about partly because we don't recognize it, because we don't see it, because we don't understand it, or even because we don't want to think it exists. Now, there may be some truth in the fact that people are essentially good. We know from Schelling's quotes just now that there is a kind of goodness. Even at the heart of evil, there's a kind of goodness. Right? This is why animals can't be evil in the same way, but a human can, because it has that memory of wholeness. It has a centrum of its own, and it has that free will to do with it what it will. So there's some kind of truth in that. But if we misunderstand that and hold on to that absolutely, it creates an opposite. So in some part, evil comes about precisely because we don't know it, we don't want to know it, or we can't understand it. So I would ask then, what is the greater source of evil in the world? Is it the conventional Jungian psychology assumption of, oh, it's just the evil that we project onto others, this one-sided view of, it's just your own evil that you're seeing out there? But hang on, what, am I the only source of evil here? So what's actually going on here? Where is it coming from? How can it possibly be true that me or you or someone else is just projecting their own evil onto the world, and not the case that others aren't seeing it in you perfectly validly? So we have to honor the other side, that sometimes actually what we do see is a violation of truth and the natural order, and we can understand that in terms of the work of Schelling, the work of Hegel, and the dissonance loops. But there's a second possibility here, and that is that maybe our failure to see evil and call it for what it is actually, if not a greater source of evil in the world, at least another equally important source that we need to consider. That actually it's not just that we judge other people as evil and that's why it happens. Right? Oh, Hitler was just the way he was because everyone just judged him that way. I mean, that's clearly ridiculous. But actually it's because we don't understand it. We have some kind of innate archetypal understanding of it, but that quickly becomes usurped and misdirected in failures of understanding. And so unless we can truly understand it, and that does involve seeing it in oneself as well, understanding that, but at its core, it's not just an excess of something. It's not just that, you took your persona too far. It goes further than that. And there are no shortage of reminders and examples of what we might call absolute evil. Someone who can take their idea to such an extreme that it just becomes unequivocal to anyone who's even looking that this is not just a question of degree. This is not just a mere absence of perfection. This is an active, willful force. And how more obvious do you want it to be? How more coarse and depraved do you need it to be in order to see it? So there's these two factors here. Yes, okay, there might be the judgment, so-called, but there might be some truth in that we need to honor. But there's also, and I think this is probably a greater source here, that there's the misunderstanding of evil. There's the failure to see it for what it is. And by the way, these two aren't completely unrelated either, because sometimes the failure to see it is an ignorance of it, precisely because to see it would be to undermine something that you yourself are doing. Like, you don't want to see it because it forces you to confront aspects of yourself that you don't like. So contrary to what is often thought, that we just see what we ourselves are secretly doing, sometimes we don't see what we are doing for precisely the same reason, until it becomes normalized and amplified to such a degree that we can't not see it. So sometimes the reason we see things is because we understand them, we are aware of them, and sometimes we don't see them precisely because we are doing them as well. So we talked about projection before. There's a lot more kinds of projection we need to think about. So the next question then would be, well, therefore, we know that we don't only see our badness, but we see our goodness in others as well, unconsciously and consciously, and with wholesome intentions and with unwholesome intentions. What goodness and badness actually are, I've attempted to delineate that with the dissonance loop concept. But just building on this inner conscience that we all have, and this basic understanding that we all have as a minimum, that which is the more pressing shadow task? Is it to cease projecting our evil onto others and bringing it about through that projection, through that process? How about this? Is it to cease projecting your goodness onto others when it isn't necessarily there? Or at least when it purports to be good and it's not entirely what's there, right? So one might be projecting our evil and manifesting that, bringing that about. And the other might be projecting our goodness and then falling prey to a lack of it, believing that what we're seeing is almost entirely good, or it's a colleague or a partner or whatever it is, and then falling prey to a lack of it. We meet that negation when the reality falls just undeniably short of the thing we thought we saw. So which is the greater task? Ceasing to project evil or ceasing to project goodness? And while a lot of the common talk on shadow work might assume it's the first one, I think it's both. And I don't even want to say which one I think is more important than the other, because I think they're both critically important. But let's just emphasize the second one, that actually maybe the reason you're seeing good is because you have goodness that you yourself aren't yet fully embracing. So there's always a place for caution, but actually to deny inner goodness is another kind of inflation. It's another kind of projection as well. So part of shadow work is actually about becoming very, very conscious of your own goodness as well. And then understanding it objectively, clearly, with all its shortfalls and limitations. And at the same time, we do project because there's a purpose to that, and there's a way of us understanding that in others. But we can do that consciously and understand that we're actually learning also about ourselves and the other at the same time. But that's different from just being swept up in it and believing that we're seeing all this goodness. This is what happened with Hitler. This is what happened with Stalin. It's not that people just judged them as evil and thought, oh, we're just going to be so judgmental towards this person, they might as well just go and meet all our expectations because we're just giving them no other option. It was also because people thought they were heroes. So seeing goodness, and here's the key, there was some goodness there. Like you cannot say there wasn't. Like I spoke about a few episodes ago, like Hitler's love for dogs and his artistic proclivities and these kinds of things. There's a kind of goodness there, but I want you to not misunderstand me, understand the nuance of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is exactly the same thing that Schelling is saying. The feeling that still remains when having strayed from the centrum, that he was all things, namely in and with God. So for that reason, even the darkest evil, it doesn't matter what it is, it still is kinda from that same place. Let's just say it's from the place of freedom, and it's freedom that is good, ultimately, right? So that's all I've got to say on that for now. I'm going to leave you with that food for thought, that question. Feel free to let me know your answers to that. What do you think is the more pressing shadow task? Is it to cease projecting evil, or is it to cease projecting goodness? So with that, I shall thank you for your time and attention. By the way, if you'd like to read some of my writing on this, you can check out an essay I wrote called The Dialectics of Shadow, which is where I basically go over this model and everything I've been talking about in this series so far. It's a fairly long one, it's like 10,000 words or something. But yeah, if you prefer reading, that's another way of doing it. I will put the link to that down below. But until next time, I'll thank you for your time and attention, and see you soon.